In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a festive cooking contest turns deadly when 3 judges collapse, poisoned by a sinister dish. A torn recipe page, a spilled jar of saffron, and a hidden scrap point to a bitter rivalry between Clara Hen, the local baker, and Victor Grange, a charming outsider with exotic spices. As whispers of sabotage and revenge swirl, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of deception where pride and poison collide. Who tampered with the spices, and what secret lies in the ruined recipe? The truth is as sharp as a village scandal, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 1. The village fatteth sun dappled the green of St. Mary Mead with a golden warmth, casting playful shadows across the stalls of the annual summer fete. The air hummed with the chatter of villagers, the clink of teacups, and the enticing scents of freshly baked scones and bubbling jams. At the heart of the festivities stood the cooking contest tent, its canvas flaps fluttering like the wings of an eager butterfly. This was no ordinary village event. It was the stage for a culinary battle that had tongues wagging for weeks. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair beneath a venerable oak, surveyed the scene with her quiet, bird-like gaze, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm in her lap. The contest, a tradition as old as the church spire, drew competitors from St. Mary Mead and beyond. This year, the rivalry was particularly fierce. Clara Henshaw, a spinster of 40 with a sharp nose and an even sharper talent for pastry, was the village favourite. Her lemon tarts, with their buttery crusts and zesty curd, were spoken of with reverence at the Women's Institute. Opposite her, in both station and style, was Victor Grange, a newcomer to the village whose dark eyes and foreign airs had set many a heart aflutter. His reputation rested on bold, exotic dishes, chutneys, laced with unfamiliar spices, curries that whispered of distant lands. The prize, a silver ladle polished to a mirror's shine, was more than a trophy. It was a badge of supremacy in a village where culinary prowess carried weight. Miss Marple's eyes, deceptively mild behind her spectacles, missed little. She noted Clara's brisk efficiency as she arranged her ingredients with the precision of a general marshalling troops. Victor, by contrast, moved with a theatrical flourish, his hands darting between jars of vibrant powders and glistening oils. The crowd buzzed with speculation. "Clara's tart will take it," murmured Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, to her neighbour. "But that Mr. Grange," replied the other. "He's got a way with flavours, hasn't he?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. She knew well how village pride could curdle into envy, and how ambition could simmer beneath a polite exterior dot at the edge of the tent. The judges, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, and the pompous Mr. Pye from the manor sat at a linen-draped table, their faces a study in anticipation. Dr. Haydock, ever practical, scribbled notes on a pad, while Mrs. Bantry, a friend of Miss Marple's, fanned herself with a programme, her eyes bright with gossip. Mr. Pye, adjusting his monocle, looked as though he considered the entire affair beneath him, yet his fork hovered eagerly. The first dishes were presented. Clara's tart, its golden surface gleaming like a summer sunrise, and Victor's chutney, a deep amber concoction paired with a rustic scone. The judges tasted, nodded, and conferred in low tones, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the festive canopy. Miss Marple's needles paused as she caught a fleeting exchange. Clara, passing Victor's station, cast a glance at his spice jars, her lips tightening. Victor, in turn, watched her with a cool, appraising stare, his fingers brushing a small glass bottle labelled saffron. It was a moment so brief that none but Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing what others overlooked, would have noticed. She tucked the observation away, like a stitch in her knitting, and resumed her work. The fete carried on, with children laughing and the band striking up a jaunty tune, but Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, even the sweetest occasions could hide a bitter aftertaste. Chapter 2. The unexpected illness. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, painting the sky above St. Mary Mead with streaks of pink and gold, when the festive hum of the village fete turned to a discordant murmur. The cooking contest, the jewel of the day's events, had concluded with applause and anticipation. The judges retreating to deliberate over their scorecards. Miss Jane Marple, still seated beneath her oak, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the fading music of the village band, observed the crowd with her usual quiet vigilance. The air, once thick with the sense of baked goods and summer blooms, now carried a faint undercurrent of unease, like a discordant note in an otherwise pleasant melody. Inside the contest tent, the judges Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, and Mr. Pye had sampled the final dishes with the solemnity of a jury. Clara Henshaw's lemon tart, its crust a marvel of buttery fragility, had elicited murmurs of approval. Victor Granger's spiced chutney, served alongside a dense, savoury scone, had sparked more animated discussion, its bold flavours a departure from the village's usual fare. The crowd had dispersed to enjoy the fate's other a tambola and a stall of homemade cordials while awaiting the announcement of the silver ladle's winner. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her sharp eyes catching the small details others overlooked, a nervous twitch in Clara's smile as she tidied her station. The way Victor's hand lingered near his spice jars, as if guarding a secret. It was Mrs. Bantry who first sounded the alarm. She emerged from the judging tent, her face flushed beneath her wide-brimmed hat, her fan forgotten in her hand. "Jane," she called, spotting Miss Marple. "Something's terribly wrong." Her voice, usually bright with gossip, trembled with urgency. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her movements deliberate but swift, her mind already turning over possibilities. As she followed Mrs. Bantry into the tent, a small crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion. Inside, the scene was one of disarray. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Mr. Pye, who was slumped in his chair, his monocle dangling from its chain, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Mrs. Bantry herself looked unsteady, clutching the table's edge, while a third judge, Miss Eliza Finch, a spinster known for her discerning palate, sat fanning herself weakly, her breath coming in short gasps. "It came on so suddenly," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice low but urgent. "We were discussing the scores. Clara's tart was divine, and Victor's chutney. Oh, it was extraordinary, so pungent. But then Mr. Pye began to cough, and Miss Finch felt faint, and I feel quite queer myself." Dr. Haydock, his medical bag already open, was administering smelling salts to Miss Finch, his brow furrowed. "Food poisoning, I'd wager," he said grimly, glancing at the remnants of the dishes on the table. "But we need to be certain. I've sent for the ambulance from Much Benham." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, swept the scene. The judging table was a tableau of half-eaten plates, Clara's tart, its curd slightly disturbed by forks, Victor's chutney, its rich amber hue still vibrant in its bowl, and a scattering of scones, some crumbled, some untouched. She noted the judges' water glasses, one tipped over, its contents pooling on the linen. The tent, though open to the evening air, felt stifling, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. Which dish was tasted last? Miss Marple asked, her voice mild but precise. Mrs. Bantry blinked, as if startled by the question. Victor's. Chutney, she said. We saved it for last, because of its strong flavour. It was unforgettable. Her hand went to her stomach, and she winced. Dr. Haydock, overhearing, nodded. That's my suspicion too. Something in that chutney, perhaps. But we'll need tests to confirm. He turned to a young constable, newly arrived and looking out of his depth. Secure the tent, Jenkins. No one touches anything until we. No more. The crowd outside grew restive, their voices a low buzz of speculation. Poisoned, hissed Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, to a knot of onlookers. That foreigner's chutney, mark my words. Her neighbour, Mrs. Clement, shook her head. Clara's tart was off, I'll bet. She's been too proud since last year's win. The accusations flew, each villager eager to pin blame, but Miss Marple, standing quietly at the tent's entrance, let the words wash over her. She knew better than to trust the hasty judgments of a crowd. Human nature, she had long observed, was prone to leap before it looked. Inside, she approached the judging table, her steps careful, her eyes scanning for anything amiss. The chutney bowl caught her attention, its contents gleaming under the tense lanterns. Beside it lay Victor's spice jars, neatly aligned, though one a small glass vial labelled saffron stood slightly askew, its lid not fully tightened. She bent closer, her nose wrinkling at a faint, acrid scent that was not quite the warm, earthy note of true saffron. Her mind flickered to a case from years past, a poisoning in a neighbouring village where a mislabelled herb had caused havoc. Curious, she murmured, straightening up. She made no move to touch the jar, knowing the constable would soon cordon it off, but she filed the detail away. Victor Grange, summoned by the constable, appeared at the tent's flap, his dark eyes wary. This is nonsense, he said, his voice clipped with a trace of an accent Miss Marple could not place. My chutney was perfect. I tasted it myself this morning. His hands, she noted, were clenched, and a bead of sweat glistened at his temple despite the cool evening air. Clara Henshaw, arriving moments later, was no less defensive. If anyone's to blame, it's not me, she said, her voice sharp as a paring knife. My tart was made with the freshest ingredients. I've never had a complaint in 20 years. Her cheeks flushed, and she cast a pointed glance at Victor, who met her gaze with a cool stare. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as always, listened without comment. She knew the value of silence, how it allowed others to reveal more than they intended. Clara's indignation seemed genuine, but there was a brittleness to it, as if she feared more than just a tarnished reputation. Victor's composure, meanwhile, was too studied, his words too carefully chosen. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Clara, she recalled, had been bested by Victor in a contest the previous year, a slight that had stung her pride. Victor, for his part, was an enigma, his past as opaque as the chutney he so proudly served. Had one of them, she wondered, crossed a line from rivalry to malice? Dr. Haydock, having stabilized the judges, joined Miss Marple near the table. It's a bad business, Jane, he said quietly. The symptoms nausea, dizziness, abdominal pain point to something ingested. I've seen cases like this before, and it's rarely an accident. His eyes flicked to the chutney bowl, that spice mix of his. It's the likely culprit, but we'll need the lab to confirm. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. And yet, she said softly, A dish so bold might mask something subtler. We mustn't assume too quickly. The ambulance arrived, its siren cutting through the fate's fading cheer. The judges were whisked away, Mr. Pye muttering weakly about lawsuits, Miss Finch still pale, and Mrs. Bantry insisting she was quite all right, really, though her hand trembled as she clutched Miss Marple's arm. The tent was sealed, the constable standing guard, and the crowd dispersed, their excitement soured by fear. Miss Marple, however, remained, her gaze lingering on the table. She thought of the torn recipe page Mrs. Bantry had mentioned in passing earlier that day, found in the bin near Clara's station. It had been dismissed as carelessness, but Miss Marple was not so sure. A recipe, like a letter or a will, could hold secrets worth hiding. As she walked back to her cottage, the village now quiet under a starlit sky, Miss Marple's mind worked like her knitting needles, looping and knotting the threads of what she had seen. The spilled saffron, the torn recipe, the judge's sudden illness, it was a puzzle, and she was certain the pieces fit together, if only she could find the pattern. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once teased her about seeing mysteries in every village spat. "You're quite wrong, dear," she had told him. "It's not that I see mysteries, it's that I see people, and people, she knew, were rarely as simple as they seemed." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The fate had ended in chaos, but she was undeterred. Tomorrow she would visit the tent again, speak to Mrs. Bantry, and perhaps have a word with young Constable Jenkins, who was earnest but inexperienced. There was something afoot in St. Mary Mead, something darker than a spoiled dish, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and her unerring instinct, was determined to uncover it. Chapter 3. The Torn Recipe. The morning after the fete dawned crisp and clear over St. Mary Mead, the village stirring slowly under a sky of unblemished blue. The chaos of the previous evening lingered like a sour note, the memory of the judge's sudden illness casting a pall over the usual bustle of market day. Miss Jane Marple, rising early as was her habit, sipped her tea by the window of her neat cottage, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the high street. The cooking contest tent, now a silent sentinel on the green, was cordoned off with rope, a young constable stationed at its entrance. Her knitting lay folded on the table, but her mind was far from idle, weaving through the events of the previous day with the precision of her needles. She had not slept as soundly as usual. Her thoughts snagged on the details of the fete, the judge's collapse, the acrid whiff of Victor's saffron jar, and, most intriguingly, the torn recipe page Mrs. Bantry had mentioned in passing. That scrap of paper, discarded in a bin near Clara Henshaw's station, seemed to Miss Marple not a mere accident, but a thread in a larger tapestry. She resolved to examine it herself, knowing that in a village like St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, even a torn page could speak volumes. After breakfast, Miss Marple donned her tweed coat and a sensible hat, her appearance as unremarkable as ever, though her eyes gleamed with purpose. She made her way to the green, where the fate's remnants a scattering of streamers. A forgotten trestle table lay forlorn under the morning sun. The tent loomed ahead, its canvas sagging slightly, as if weary from the previous days. Drama. Constable Jenkins, barely 20 and visibly nervous, stood guard, his helmet slightly askew. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "No one's to go in, I'm afraid. Doctor's orders, and the inspectors coming from Much Benham." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as milk. Of course, Constable. I wouldn't dream of interfering. But perhaps you could tell me where, exactly, was that recipe page found. Mrs. Bantry mentioned it, and I do so hate loose ends. Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, but Jenkins, unused to such inquiries, flushed and pointed toward a metal bin near the tent side. There, ma'am. One of the cleaners found it last night, half burned, like someone tried to get rid of it. It's with the evidence now. Half burned, Miss Marple repeated softly, her gaze drifting to the bin. How curious. She thanked Jenkins and wandered toward the bin, her steps slow but deliberate. It was empty now, its contents presumably taken for inspection. But she noted its position, close to Clara's station, yet near enough to Victor's that either could have reached it. She pictured the scene, Clara's precise movements, Victor's theatrical flair, and wondered who might have had cause to tear and discard a recipe. A mistake, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Mrs. Bantry, arriving to oversee the fate's clean-up, spotted Miss Marple and hurried over, her cheeks pink with exertion. "Jane, you're just the person I need," she exclaimed, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. "This business is dreadful. Poor Mr. Pye is still in hospital, and Miss Finch says she'll never eat chutney again. And Claro, she's in a state, insisting her tart couldn't possibly be to blame." She lowered her voice, her eyes bright with gossip. "But that recipe page, Jane, I saw it myself before Jenkins took it. It was Clara's. No mistake, her handwriting, her lemon tart recipe. But the ingredients list was torn off, and the edges were singed, as if someone tried to burn it and thought better of it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Torn and singed," she mused, "and found near Clara's station. Did you see anyone near the bin during the contest?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking, not. Really, it was all such a flurry, Clara bustling about, Victor tossing spices like a magician. "But I did notice Clara looking cross when Victor's chutney got such praise. And Victor, well, he was watching her too, wasn't he? Like a cat with a mouse." Miss Marple nodded, filing the observation away. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and, with a polite excuse, made her way to the vicarage, where she knew the Fates Committee kept spare supplies and, perhaps, a chance to learn more. The vicarage garden was quiet, its roses nodding in the breeze, and Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was sorting through a box of linens used at the fete. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, looking up, "what a to-do about the contest. I heard about that recipe page. Clara's beside herself, saying someone's trying to ruin her." "Did she say who?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Mrs. Clement hesitated, then leaned closer. "She didn't name names, but she hinted at Victor. Said he's too clever by half, always flaunting his foreign recipes. Mind you, Victor's been saying Clara's jealous, that she can't stand losing. It's all very nasty." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the rivalry. She recalled Clara's tight-lipped glance at Victor's spice jars, and Victor's guarded demeanor when questioned. A torn recipe, she thought, might be a distraction or a deliberate clue. At the vicarage, Miss Marple asked to see any items left from the contest. Mrs. Clement produced a small crate containing odds and ends. A cracked mixing bowl, a stained apron, and a few stray utensils. Among them was a notebook, its cover worn but unmistakably Clara's, with her initials embossed in faded gold. "This was left in the tent," Mrs. Clement said. "I thought it was Clara's, but she hasn't claimed it." Miss Marple opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the pages. Most were filled with recipes in Clara's precise hand scones, jams, a Victoria sponge butt. One page was missing, its edge jagged where it had been torn out. "This must be the book the page came from," Miss Marple said, softly. "May I borrow it, Mrs. Clement? I'll return it to Clara myself." With the notebook tucked into her bag, Miss Marple returned to the green, her thoughts circling the torn page. Why tear out a recipe? To hide something, perhaps an ingredient, a method, or even a mistake. But the singed edges suggested haste or fear of discovery. She pictured Clara, proud and meticulous, guarding her recipes like treasures. Would she destroy one of her own? Or had someone else done so to cast suspicion on her? Victor, with his exotic spices and guarded past, seemed a likely candidate, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. People, she had learned, were rarely so obvious. She approached Constable Jenkins again, who was now joined by Inspector Craddock, a young man from Much Benham whose brisk efficiency belied his inexperience with village intrigues. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding politely, "I hear you've been asking about the recipe page. It's with the lab now, but I can tell you it's Clara's handwriting, no doubt. The ingredients list was torn off, and there were burn marks, as if someone tried to destroy it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the bin, did you find anything else in it?" Craddock shook his head. "Just the usual rubbish wrappers, a broken spoon. Nothing suspicious." Miss Marple thanked him and turned her attention to the tent's interior, now accessible with Craddock's permission. The judging table remained as it had been, the dishes sealed in bags for analysis. She lingered near Clara's station, where a faint scent of lemon still hung in the air. The counter was spotless, a testament to Clara's fastidiousness, but Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small detail, a smudge of flour on the edge of the bin, as if someone had leaned against it while tossing something inside. She filed it away, her mind returning to the saffron jar at Victor's station, its lid askew, its contents suspect. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Clara at her cottage, a tidy dwelling with a garden bursting with herbs. Clara, pale and tense, invited her in, with reluctance. "I don't know why everyone's pointing fingers at me," she said, her hands twisting a dishcloth. "My tart was perfect. I've made it 100 times." Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea, nodded sympathetically. "Of course, my dear, but that recipe page, why would it be torn and discarded?" Clara's eyes widened, then narrowed. "I didn't tear it. Someone must have taken it from my book. Victor, old Betty's, always snooping, trying to steal my ideas." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression bland but her mind alert. Clara's indignation was convincing, but there was a tremor in her voice, a hint of something unspoken. "And your notebook," Miss Marple said, producing it from her bag. "This was found in the tent. Is it yours?" Clara's face flushed as she took it, flipping through the pages. "Yes, it's mine. I thought I'd lost it. But look, someone's torn out my tart recipe." She held up the jagged edge, her voice rising. "This proves it. Someone's trying to frame me." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Clara's hands, noting their slight tremble. She thought of the singed page, the flour smudge, the rivalry that crackled between Clara and Victor like a live wire. "We shall see," she said gently, rising to leave. As she walked back to her cottage, the village settling into its evening. Quiet, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the torn recipe. It was not just a piece of paper, she was certain, but a key to a darker truth. Someone had wanted it gone, and someone had wanted it found. The question was who and why. Back at home, she settled into her armchair, the notebook open before her. The torn edge was clean, deliberate, not the result of carelessness. She thought of Victor's guarded demeanor, Clara's brittle pride, and the judge's sudden illness. The pieces were there, waiting to be fitted together. Miss Marple. Needles resumed their rhythm, clicking softly as her mind worked. In St. Mary Mead, she knew even the smallest clue could unravel the most tangled mystery. Chapter 4. The Spilled Spice. The second day after the ill-fated fate broke over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm. The village green bathed in soft morning light that belied the undercurrent of unease rippling through its cottages. The cooking contest tent, now a focal point of whispered speculation, stood silent, its canvas flaps sealed under the watchful eye of Constable Jenkins. Miss Jane Marple, having breakfasted lightly on toast and tea, gazed out her cottage window, her thoughts as sharp as the Douglas and cobwebs in her garden. The torn recipe page, singed and discarded, occupied her mind. But another detail tugged at her memory: the saffron jar at Victor Granger's station, its contents spilled and its scent oddly medicinal. She knew, from long experience, that such anomalies were rarely accidents. Miss Marple's morning plan was clear. She would revisit the tent, speak with Inspector Craddock if he was about, and examine the scene with fresh eyes. Her tweed coat donned and her hat pinned neatly, she stepped into the high street, nodding to passers-by with her usual mild courtesy. The village was abuzz with gossip, the judge's illness fueling theories as varied as the blooms in Mrs. Clement's garden. "It's that chutney," declared Mr. Price, the butcher, as he swept his shop stoop. "Foreign muck, that's what." His wife, overhearing, countered, "Clara's tart wasn't right, you mark me. Too sharp, if you ask." Miss Marple, passing by, let the words drift over her, knowing how village tongues could obscure truth as much as reveal it. At the green, the tent loomed, its ropes taut against the breeze. Constable Jenkins, looking slightly less harried than the day before, touched his cap. "Morning, Miss Marple. Inspector's inside, taking measurements or some such. You're not to disturb, he says, but I reckon he'd make an exception for you." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "You're very kind, Constable. I only wish to have a peek, if I may. Loose ends, you know they do bother one so." Jenkins, disarmed by her gentle tone, hesitated, then nodded. "Just a quick look." Mind, inside, the tent was dim, the air heavy with the faint scents of lemon, spice, and canvas. Inspector Craddock, a lean man with a brisk manner, was crouched near Victor's station, a notebook in hand. He glanced up, his expression a mix of respect and mild exasperation. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd turn up. You've a knack for being where things happen." She inclined her head, her smile serene. "I'm only an old spinster, Inspector, with too much time on my hands. But I did wonder about that saffron jar, the one that was spilled. Has it been tested?" Craddock straightened, his eyes narrowing. "You're sharp, I'll give you that. The jar's with the lab, along with the chutney and the tart. Preliminary report suggests something off about the saffronot, your usual spice. That's certain. But we're waiting on specifics." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Victor's station, where the counter was bare save for a few stray grains of what might have been saffron, glinting dully under the tent's lanterns. She recalled the jar's smudged label, its lid askew, and the faint acrid odor that had caught her attention. "Spilled in haste, perhaps," she murmured. or spilled to hide something. Craddock, sensing her drift, raised an eyebrow. You think it's deliberate, not just a clumsy accident? Miss Marple's eyes met his, their mildness masking a steely clarity. In my experience, Inspector, accidents are often convenient for those who wish to mislead. A spilled jar, like a torn recipe, draws the eye where someone wants it drawn. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. You're thinking of that recipe page, aren't you? Clara's torn and singed. I've got my men looking into both her and Victor. Rivalry's a powerful motive. Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. She thanked Craddock and stepped closer to Victor's station, her movements careful, as if not to disturb the air itself. The counter, though cleaned by the police, bore faint traces of the spiller scattering of golden red grains that seemed too uniform, too artfully arranged. She bent slightly, her nose twitching at a whiff of something sharp, not the warm, honeyed note of true saffron. It reminded her of a case from her youth, when a chemist's apprentice in a neighboring village had mistaken one powder for another, with dire results. Labels, she said softly, are only as honest as the hand that writes them. Leaving the tent, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Bantry's home at Gossington Hall. Knowing her friend would have the latest village news, Mrs. Bantry, recovered from her ordeal but still pale, welcomed her into the drawing-room where a fire crackled despite the mild day. Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes, she said, pouring tea. I'm still shaky from that wretched chutney. Dr. Haydock says I'll be fine, but Mr. Pye's in a dreadful state, and Miss Finch swears she's retiring from judging forever. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. They're saying it's poison, Jane. Not just bad food, but poison. Can you imagine? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression composed. It's a serious matter, Dolly. But poison, if it was, requires planning. Tell me, did you notice anything odd about Victor's spices during the contest? That saffron jar, for instance. Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking, well, he was very particular about his spices, always arranging them just so. But I do recall him knocking over that jar when the judges were tasting his chutney. He laughed it off, said he was nervous, but it made a mess. Why do you ask? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A spill can be a distraction, my dear, or a way to dispose of evidence. She set her cup down, her mind turning to Victor's demeanor, his cool stare, his quick denial of fault. She recalled to Clara's accusation that Victor had snooped around her recipes, and the torn page from her notebook, found so conveniently near her station. The two incidents, spilled spice, torn recipes, seemed linked, like stitches in a pattern she was only beginning to discern. From Gossington Hall, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, held court over a counter laden with sweets and gossip. Miss Weatherby, a woman with a nose for news, was eager to share. Oh, Miss Marple, it's a scandal. They're saying Victor's chutney was poisoned, but I heard Clara's tart wasn't above suspicion, and that recipe page-torn to bits, they say. Clara was in here yesterday, buying flour, and she looked fit to burst, saying someone's out to ruin her. Miss Marple, selecting a tin of biscuits, asked casually, did Clara mention Victor, or anyone else? Miss Weatherby's eyes sparkled. She didn't name him outright, but she said, some people think they're clever, bringing fancy spices from who knows where, and Victor, when he came in for stamps, was just as prickly, said Clara's. Jealous because her tarts are same old, same old. It's a feud, if you ask me. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her thoughts circling the rivalry. A feud, yes, but was it enough to drive one to poison? And if so, whose hand had spilled the spice, and whose had torn the page? Her next stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found him sorting through his notes from the fate. "Jane, you're here about the poisoning, I suppose," he said, his tone gruff but fond. "The labs confirmed it's some sort of alkaloid in the chutney, not naturally occurring. Could have come from that saffron jar, but we're still testing. The judges are lucky. A stronger dose might have been fatal." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "An alkaloid, you say? Not a common spice, then?" Haydock shook his head. "No, and not something you'd find in a village kitchen. Whoever used it knew what they were doing." Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the green, her mind racing. An alkaloid, deliberately added, suggested not just malice but knowledge, perhaps even a background in chemistry or medicine. She thought of Victor's vague past, his mention of catering abroad, and wondered what else he might have studied. Clara, too, was no simple baker. Her herb garden hinted at a deeper interest in plants, and the spilled saffron, had it been, meant to contaminate the chutney or to divert suspicion from another source. Back at the tent, Miss Marple lingered near Victor's station, now empty but for the ghost of that spill. She pictured him knocking over the jar, his laugh too quick, his hands too steady. She thought, too, of Clara's notebook, its torn page, a silent accusation. The two, clues, spice and paper, were entwined, she was certain, but the knot of their connection eluded her. As she walked home, the village settling into its afternoon hush, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Rivalry was potent, but poison was personal. Someone had wanted the judges harmed, and someone had wanted Clara blamed. The spilled spice, like the torn recipe, was a breadcrumb in a trail she was determined to follow. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, the notebook open before her. She traced the jagged edge of the missing page, her fingers pausing at a faint smudge of ink, as if the tear had been made in haste. Her knitting needles lay idle, but her mind clicked like a metronome, sorting through the day's discoveries. The spilled saffron, the alkaloid, the torn recipe, it was a puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, knew she was close to fitting the pieces together. In St. Mary Mead, she thought, even the smallest spill could hide the deepest secret. Chapter 5. The Rival's Motive. The third morning after the fateful fete in St. Mary Mead dawned with a mist that clung to the village like a whispered secret, softening the outlines of cottages and draping the green in a gauzy veil. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood at her cottage window, her tea cooling as she gazed toward the now infamous cooking contest tent, its silhouette faint through the haze. The events of the past days, the judge's illness, the torn recipe page, the spilled saffron with its suspect scent had woven a web of suspicion that tightened around Clara, Henshaw, and Victor Grange. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needle she threaded for her morning knitting, turned to motive, that invisible thread that so often bound a crime's scattered clues. She had learned much already. The torn page from Clara's notebook, singed, as if to destroy evidence. The saffron jar, its contents laced with an alkaloid, and the simmering rivalry between Clara, the village's pride, and Victor, the enigmatic outsider. Yet it was motive, Miss Marple knew, that would unravel the tangle. Rivalry alone was not enough. It took a deeper wound, pride, envy, or revenge to drive one to poison. She resolved to probe further, to seek out the currents beneath the village's placid surface. Her tweed coat donned, Her hat pinned with care, she stepped into the mist, her steps as purposeful as her thoughts. The high street was quiet, the mist muffling the clatter of early deliveries and the chatter of shopkeepers. Miss Marple's first stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was known to hold a treasure trove of village lore. The vicarage, with its ivy-clad walls and tidy lawns, seemed a haven from the scandal, but Mrs. Clement's eyes were bright with the excitement of it all when she welcomed Miss Marple into the parlour. "Oh, Jane, it's dreadful," she said, pouring tea from a chipped pot. "The whole village is talking poison in the chutney, they say, and Clara's recipe torn to bits. I can't believe either of them would do such a thing, but then, Clara's been so prickly since last year." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Last year?" she asked, her voice mild but her interest keen. Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, yes. You weren't at the Much Benham fete, were you?" Clara entered her lemon tart, same as always, but Victor was there, too, with some spicy disho. I don't recall what, but it was exotic. He won the silver ladle, and Clara was livid. Said he'd cheated, used ingredients no one could pronounce. She's never forgiven him, and now he's here, in our village, rubbing her nose in it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over this new piece. A defeat, especially to a newcomer, would sting a woman like Clara, whose baking was her crown. And Victor, she asked, did he speak of Clara after that? Mrs. Clement nodded vigorously. He was at the vicarage tea last month, boasting about his travels, India, Morocco, places like that. When Clara's name came up, he smiled, ever so sly, and said she was stuck in the last century. I thought it cruel, but he laughed it off. The words lingered with Miss Marple as she thanked Mrs. Clement and left, her thoughts circling the rivalry's depth. Clara's pride, wounded by last year's loss, could have festered into something darker, but Victor's taunt suggested he, too, relished the contest's edge, perhaps enough to provoke a sabotage. She recalled his guarded demeanour at the tent, his quick dismissal of the spilled saffron as an accident. Was it pride that drove him, or something more calculated? Her next stop was the village hall, where the fete committee was sorting through. The aftermath. Mrs. Bantry, bustling among crates of decorations, greeted her with a wave. "Jane, you're a godsend. This business has everyone in a tizzy. Clara's been here, demanding her notebook back, saying it's proof someone's out to get her. And Victor, well, he's been oddly quiet, hasn't he? Not his usual swagger." Miss Marple, helping to fold a tablecloth, asked casually, "Did Clara mention why she thinks someone took her recipe page?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, her hands pausing. "She said it was to make her look careless, to ruin her reputation." She pointed the finger at Victor. "Of course," said he's always snooping around her recipes, trying to steal her secrets. "But I wonder, Jane." Victor's chutney was the talk of the fete, and now it's poisoned 3 judges. If anyone's reputation is ruined, it's his. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. The torn page, she mused, could indeed be a ploy to shift blame, but to whom and why? Leaving the hall, Miss Marple made her way to Victor's lodgings, a modest flat above the village bakery. She knocked, and after a moment Victor appeared, his dark eyes wary but polite. "Miss Marple," he said, his accent faint but unpronounceable, "to what do I owe the visit?" She smiled, her demeanour as disarming as a grandmother's. "I was passing, Mr. Grange, and thought to ask how you're faring." The fete was quite an ordeal. Victor's jaw tightened, but he invited her in, his flat sparsely furnished, but neat, with a shelf of spice jars gleaming like jewels. "I'm managing," he said, pouring tea with a practiced hand. "But the village has made up its mind I'm the villain because my chutney was last. Never mind that I ate it myself hours before, with no ill effects." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the spice jars, noting their labels: cumin, coriander, saffron. "Your spices are quite remarkable," she said. "From your travels, I presume?" Victor nodded, a hint of pride breaking through his reserve. "Years abroad, India mostly. I learned to blend flavors you won't find in a village pantry. Clara thinks it's trickery, but it's skill." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "And yet, one of your jars spilled, didn't it? Saffron, I believe." Victor's hand paused on his teacup. "A clumsy moment," he said quickly. "I was rushed, with the judges hovering. It happens." But his eyes, Miss Marple noted, did not meet hers, and his fingers tapped the table, a rhythm of unease. She thanked him and left her thoughts. Turning to his past, "India," he said, but what else had he learnt there? Chemistry, perhaps, or the properties of less savoury substances. At the village shop, Miss Weatherby was eager to share more gossip. "Victor's been asking about Clara's recipes for weeks," she confided, handing Miss Marple a packet of needles. "Said he wanted to understand the competition, and Claro, she's been snapping at everyone, saying her notebooks, her life's work. If you ask me, they're both too proud for their own good." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the torn page. Pride, yes, but was it Clara's fear of losing again, or Victor's need to dominate, that had tipped into malice? She visited Dr. Haydock next, finding him at his surgery, his desk strewn with reports. "Jane, you're relentless," he said, with a wry smile. "The labs confirmed the alkaloid in the saffron jarred, definitely not saffron. It's a rare compound, used in small doses for medicine, but toxic in larger ones. Whoever put it there knew its effects." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And the torn recipe page?" she asked. Haydock shrugged. "No trace of poison on it, but the lab's still analyzing. It's Clara's handwriting, though, and the burn marks suggest someone wanted it gone." Miss Marple thanked him and walked to Clara's cottage, her mind weaving the threads together. Clara, pale and defensive, was tending her herb garden when Miss Marple arrived. "I've nothing more to say," Clara said, her voice sharp. "My tart was perfect, and that notebook proves someone's framing me." Miss Marple, peering at the garden's neat rows of rosemary and thyme, asked gently, "Do you grow saffron, my dear?" Clara shook her head. "Too costly. I use what I buy, and I'm careful with it. Unlike some who fling spices about like confetti." The jab at Victor was clear, but Miss Marple noted Clara's hands, dirt-stained but steady, and the faint scent of lavender on her apron. She thought of the alkaloid, the spilled jar, the torn page. Clara's pride was palpable, but was it enough to poison a rival's dish? Or had Victor, with his knowledge of exotic compounds, orchestrated a scheme to discredit her? The motive, Miss Marple knew, lay in their past Clara's defeat. Victor's taunted in what they stood to gain, as she returned to her cottage. The mist lifting to reveal a golden afternoon, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the fates. Small details. Clara's glance at Victor's jars, Victor's tap on the table, the smudged label on the saffron. Motive was the key, but it was tangled with opportunity and means. She settled into her armchair, Clara's notebook open before her, its torn edge a silent challenge. Her knitting needles lay still, but her mind clicked like a clock, sorting through the rivalries and resentments that simmered beneath St. Mary Mead's quiet surface. The torn page and the spilled spice were clues, but the motive, whoever's it was, would unlock the truth. Chapter 6. A Curious Discovery. The fourth morning after the St. Mary Mead. Fate broke with a gentle breeze that stirred the curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, carrying the faint scent of roses from her garden. The village, though outwardly resuming its routine, hummed with an undercurrent of suspicion. The memory of the poisoned judges and the torn recipe page fueling hushed conversations in the bakery and the post office. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, gazed out at the high street, her mind as active as the sparrows flitting among the hedgerows. The clues thus far: the singed recipe fragment, the mislabeled saffron jar. The bitter rivalry between Clara Henshaw and Victor Grange formed a pattern, but it was incomplete, like a shawl with missing stitches. Today, she resolved, she would seek out a new thread, something overlooked in the chaos of the fate. Her thoughts lingered on the notebook she had retrieved from Mrs. Clement, its torn edge a silent accusation. The recipe page, found in the bin, had been Clara's, but its deliberate destruction suggested more than carelessness. The spilled saffron, too, with its toxic contents, pointed to a calculated act. Miss Marple knew that in a village like St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as daisies, the truth often hid in the mundane. She donned her tweed coat, pinned her hat with care, and set out for the vicarage, where she hoped to uncover something new among the fate's detritus. The vicarage was a hive of quiet activity, with Mrs. Clement and a gaggle of volunteers sorting through items left from the contest. The air was thick with the scent of lavender, sachets, and old linen, and Miss Marple's arrival was greeted with a warm, if distracted, smile. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," Mrs. Clement said, brushing dust from her hands. "We're still clearing out the tense odds and ends. Such a mess, and with all this talk of poison, no one wants to touch anything." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes scanning the crates of forgotten utensils, napkins, and aprons. "I don't suppose," she said casually, "you've come across anything belonging to Clara or Victor? An apron, perhaps, or a stray tool?" Mrs. Clement's brow furrowed. "Now you mention it, there's an apron in the back. Victor's, I think. It was left in the tent near his station. I meant to return it, but with all this fuss," she led Miss Marple to a corner, where a canvas apron, stained with spices and flour, hung over a chair. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the fabric, noting its weight, heavier than expected. "May I?" she asked, and Mrs. Clement nodded, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple unfolded the apron, her movements deliberate, and felt a faint crinkle in the pocket's lining. Her heart quickened, but her face remained serene. With careful fingers, she explored the pocket, finding a small tear in the stitching. Slipping her hand inside, she drew out a folded scrap of paper, its edges crisp but unmistakably torn. She unfolded it under Mrs. Clement's watchful gaze, revealing Clara's precise handwriting, a list of ingredients for her lemon tart, the missing half of the recipe page. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Clement gasped. "Is that—" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gleaming. "It seems so. How curious that it should be hidden here, in Victor's apron." She tucked the paper into her bag, promising to show it to Inspector Craddock, and thanked Mrs. Clement, her mind already racing. The discovery was a jolt, like a dropped stitch in a familiar pattern. Why would Victor have Clara's recipe, And why hide it in such a peculiar place? The torn page in the bin had been meant to be found, its singed edges a clumsy attempt at destruction. This hidden fragment, however, suggested a deeper intent to conceal, not destroy. Miss Marple walked to the green, her steps measured but purposeful, the scrap of paper a weight in her bag. The tent was still cordoned off, but Inspector Craddock was there, conferring with Constable Jenkins. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of amusement and respect, "I should have known you'd be back. Found something, have you?" She produced the paper, explaining its discovery. Craddock's eyes narrowed as he examined it. Clara's handwriting, no doubt, and it matches the torn page. But in Victor's apron, that's a turn-up. He scratched his chin, his mind clearly working. The labs confirmed the alkaloid, as Dr. Haydock said. It was in the saffron jar, not the tart. But this recipe business, it's muddying the waters. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Or, clarifying them, Inspector. A hidden recipe suggests someone wanted to control what was known and what was suspected. Leaving Craddock to his notes, Miss Marple wandered to the village shop, where Miss Weatherby was dispensing gossip as freely as sugar. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a scandal," she exclaimed, leaning over the counter. "They're saying Victor's saffron was poisoned, but Clara's tart is under suspicion too. And now that recipe page dawn and burned. I saw Clara this morning, buying lemons, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple, selecting a packet of tea, asked, "And Victor? Has he been about?" Miss Weatherby nodded. "He was in yesterday, buying stamps, cool as you please. Said the village is out to get him, but he's not worried. Said he's faced worse abroad." The word abroad snagged Miss Marple's attention. Victor's past, vaguely sketched as years in India and elsewhere, was a shadow in the case. Had he learned more than spices in his travels? She thanked Miss Weatherby and made her way to Mrs. Bantry's, hoping her friend's knack for gossip might shed light. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry was in the garden, pruning roses with a vigour that belied her recent illness. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, setting down her shears. "I hear you've been poking about the tent. Any news?" Miss Marple, settling onto a garden bench, shared the discovery of the recipe scrap, watching Mrs. Bantry's eyes widen. "In Victor's apron," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "That's queer. Clara's been saying someone stole her recipe to make her look careless, but if Victor had it, well, it's fishy, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her bag. "Fishy, indeed. But why hide it? If Victor meant to frame Clara, why not leave the whole page in the bin? And if Clara tore it herself, why was this half in Victor's possession?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, her mind grappling with the puzzle. "You think one of them's playing a deeper game, don't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think, Dolly, that people are rarely as straightforward as they seem. A recipe is a small thing, but it can hold a great secret." She recalled Clara's herb garden, its neat rows hinting at a knowledge of plants, and Victor's spice jars, their labels too pristine, too deliberate. The hidden recipe scrap was a clue, but to what? A distraction, a deception, or a mistake? Her next stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found him reviewing the lab reports. "Jane, you're like a bloodhound," he said, chuckling. "Alkaloids confirmed definitely from the saffron jar. It's a rare compound, not something you'd stumble across in a grocer's. Whoever used it had access to specialized knowledge." Miss Marple's mind flicked to Victor's travels, then to Clara's garden, and the recipe page. She asked, Haydock shook his head. No poison on it, but the ink's fresh, as if it was written recently. Odd, for a recipe Clara's. Used for years. The fresh ink was a new thread, pulling Miss Marple's thoughts tighter. Had Clara rewritten her recipe, perhaps to hide an alteration? Or had Victor forged it, planting the torn page to shift blame? She thanked Haydock and walked to Clara's cottage, where she found the baker kneading dough with a ferocity that spoke of pent-up anger. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice tight, "I hear you found my recipe. It proves I'm innocent, doesn't it? Someone stole it to ruin me." Miss Marple, noting the flour dusting Clara's hands, asked gently, "Why would someone hide it in Victor's apron?" Clara's hands stilled. "Victor, of course. He's been after my recipes since Much Benham. He wants to humiliate me again." Her eyes flashed, but Miss Marple saw a flicker of doubt, quickly masked. She left, her thoughts turning to Victor. At his flat, he was polishing his spice jars, his movements precise but his expression guarded. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've come about that recipe nonsense. I didn't take it. Why would I? My chutney was the star." His voice was smooth, but his fingers tightened on a jar. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. "And yet, the recipe was in your apron. An odd place for it, don't you think?" Victor's jaw twitched, but he shrugged. "Someone must have planted it, Clara. Probably she's desperate to save face." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind weaving the clues, the torn page, the hidden scrap, the poisoned saffron. The fresh ink suggested a recent act, but whose and why conceal the recipe in such a way? As she returned to her cottage, the village now bathed in afternoon light, Miss Marple's thoughts circled the discovery. The recipe scrap was no accident. It was a deliberate act, meant to mislead or to protect. Clara's pride, Victor's ambition, the alkaloid's rarity, all pointed to a motive rooted in their past. She settled into her armchair, Clara's notebook open before her, the hidden scrap beside it. Her knitting lay untouched, but her mind clicked like a loom, threading the clues into a pattern. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, even a curious discovery could unravel the deepest deceit. Chapter 7. The Poisonous Plot. The 5th morning after the ill-starred St. Mary Mead, fate dawned with a heavy sky, the clouds casting a sombre pall over the village's cobblestone lanes and thatched roofs. The air was thick with the promise of rain, mirroring the unease that clung to the community like damp wool. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a single slice of toast, gazed out at the village green, where the contest tent stood as a silent witness to the recent calamity. Her mind, sharp as the silver pins in her sewing basket, wove together the threads of the mystery: the torn recipe page, singed and discarded; the saffron jar, its contents laced with a rare alkaloid; and the hidden scrap of Clara's recipe, found sewn into Victor Granger's apron. These clues pointed to a calculated act, one driven by a motive as dark as the gathering storm. Today, Miss Marple resolved she would delve deeper into the poisonous plot, seeking the hand that had orchestrated it. Her morning began with a visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery, a modest brick building tucked near the church, its windows fogged with the morning's chill. The waiting room was empty, save for the faint scent of antiseptic and a stack of well-thumbed magazines. Dr. Haydock, peering over his spectacles, greeted her with a gruff warmth. "Jane, you're at it again," he said, setting aside a lab report. "I suppose it's the poisoning business. You've a nose for trouble, haven't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her demeanor as mild as ever. I only seek clarity, Doctor. The alkaloid in the saffron jargon. You tell me more about its nature, and perhaps where one might obtain such a thing. Haydock leaned back, his fingers drumming on the desk. It's a nasty piece of work, Jane. A plant-derived alkaloid, used in trace amounts for certain medical treatments, heart conditions, mostly but toxic in larger doses. The symptoms match the judge's illness: nausea, dizziness, severe abdominal pain. It's not something you'd find in a grocer's or even a common apothecary. You'd need access to a specialized chemist, perhaps abroad, or a botanical supplier with a less than scrupulous reputation. He paused, his brow furrowing. The lab confirmed it was mixed into the saffron, cleverly masked by the spice's potency. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple's mind flicked to Victor's exotic spice jars, there, labels to pristine, and to Clara's herb garden. Its neat rows of foxgloves, hinting at a knowledge of plants' darker properties. And the recipe page, she asked. Any traces of the toxin there? Haydock shook his head. None. The torn page and the scrap you found in the apron were clean, but the ink fresh, as if written days ago, not years. That's odd, for a recipe Clara's used forever. Miss Marple nodded, the detail of the fresh ink snagging her thoughts like a burr. Thank you, Doctor, she said, rising. It's often the smallest things that unravel the largest knots. Leaving the surgery, Miss Marple made her way to the village green, where the contest tent stood cordoned off, its canvas sagging under the weight of the overcast sky. Constable Jenkins, now a familiar figure, touched his cap as she approached. Morning, Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock's in Much Benham, but he said you could have a look, if you're quick. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes scanning the tents. Dim interior. You're very kind, Constable. I shan't disturb anything. Inside, the air was heavy with the faint sense of lemon and spice, a ghost of the fates' former cheer. The judging table was bare, its dishes long removed for analysis, but Victor's station drew her gaze. The counter, though cleaned, bore faint stains where the saffron had spilled, a golden smear that seemed to whisper of deceit. She lingered, picturing Victor's quick laugh as he dismissed the spill as an accident, his hands too steady for clumsiness. The smudged label on the saffron jar, the acrid whiff she'd detected, these were no mere oversights. She recalled a case from her youth, a poisoning in a neighboring village where a mislabeled herb had caused havoc. A label, she murmured, is only as true as the hand that writes it. Stepping outside, she noted the bin near Clara's station where the torn recipe had been found, its position close enough for either competitor to have reached it. The puzzle was taking shape, but its edges were still blurred. Miss Marple's next stop was Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry was sorting through fate records in her drawing room, a fire crackling against the morning's chill. Jane, you're a godsend, Mrs. Bantry said, pouring tea. This poisoning business has everyone jumpy. Mr. Pye's still in hospital, muttering about lawsuits, and Miss Finch swears she'll never judge again. Do you think it's really Victor's doing, or could Clara have? She trailed off, her eyes bright with curiosity. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. It's a tangled affair, Dolly. The saffron was poisoned, yes, but the torn recipe, why hide half in Victor's apron? And the fresh inquiry write an old recipe? Mrs. Bantry frowned, her hands pausing on a stack of papers. You think someone's playing a deeper game, don't you? Clara's been so defensive, insisting her notebook was stolen, and Victor, well, He's all charm until you question him. I saw him at the fete, fussing with his jars, and when that saffron spilled, he laughed it off, but his eyes were sharp. Miss Marple nodded, filing the observation away. The spill, the torn page, the hidden scrap, they were threads in a deliberate pattern, woven to mislead. Leaving Gossington Hall, Miss Marple visited the village shop, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was dispensing gossip as freely as sugar. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a scandal," she exclaimed, leaning over the counter. "Poison in the saffron, they say, and Clara's recipe torn to bits. I saw Clara yesterday buying lemons, and she looked like she hadn't slept. Said someone's out to ruin her name." Miss Marple, selecting a tin of biscuits, asked casually, "And Victor, has he been about?" Miss Weatherby nodded. "This morning, buying ink, of all things. Said he keeps a ledger for his recipes, fancy for a cook. But he was jumpy, kept looking over his shoulder." The mention of ink sharpened Miss Marple's focus. The fresh ink on the recipe scrap, noted by Dr. Haydock, suggested a recent act, perhaps a forgery or a rewrite meant to deceive. She thanked Miss Weatherby and made her way to Victor's flat. Above the bakery, her steps slow but deliberate. Victor, answering her knock, was polite but guarded, his dark eyes narrowing as he invited her in. The flat was sparse, its shelves lined with spice jars that gleamed like jewels in the dim light. "Miss Marple," he said, pouring tea with a practiced hand, "I suppose you're here about the fete. I've told the inspector it was an accident, that spill. My chutney was perfect." Miss Marple's smile was disarming, her eyes sharp. "Of course, Mr. Grange, but the saffron's such a rare poison, Dr. Haydock says. From your travels, perhaps." Victor's hand paused on his teacup, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "I buy my spices from reputable suppliers," he said, his voice clipped. "If there was poison, someone tampered with it before I got it." His fingers tapped the table, a restless rhythm, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze darted to the spice jars. She thanked him and left, her thoughts turning to Clara, at Clara's cottage. The baker was in her garden, pruning foxgloves with a ferocity that spoke of pent-up anger. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, "I hear they're blaming Victor's chutney. Good. My tart was flawless, and that torn recipe proves someone's framing me." Miss Marple, peering at the foxgloves, asked gently, "Your garden is impressive, my dear. Foxgloves can be dangerous, can't they?" Clara's hands stilled, her eyes flashing. "I grow herbs for cooking, not poison. Victor's the one with his fancy spices, ask him where he got that saffron." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the alkaloid's rarity, Victor's travels, and Clara's knowledge of plants. The poisonous plot was clear. Someone had swapped the saffron for a toxin, torn Clara's recipe to cast suspicion, and hidden the scrap to deepen the deception. But whose hand had done it? Victor's guarded demeanor, Clara's defensive pride both held pieces of the truth. As she walked back to her cottage, the village hushed under the looming rain. Miss Marple's thoughts circled the clues. The fresh ink, the hidden scrap, the spilled jar. They were not accidents, but steps in a dance of deceit at home. She settled into her armchair, Clara's notebook open before her, the torn edge of the missing page, the fresh ink on the scrap. The alkaloid source, they pointed to a mind that planned not just to win, but to destroy. Her knitting needles lay still, her mind clicking like a metronome. In St. Mary Mead, she knew even the most carefully laid plot could unravel under a patient gaze, and she was determined to see it through. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The 6th day following the calamitous St. Mary Mead fate dawned with a fitful sun, its rays piercing the clouds to cast long shadows across the village green. The air was heavy with the scent of damp grass and the lingering unease that had settled over the community like a persistent fog. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a single slice of toast, gazed out at the now familiar silhouette of the contest tent, its canvas sagging under the weight of recent events. Her mind, as sharp as the silver pins securing her hat, wove together the threads of the mystery: the torn recipe page, the poisoned saffron jar, the hidden scrap in Victor Grange's apron, and the alkaloid that had felled 3 judges. These clues, she knew, pointed to a deliberate act, one born of a motive as potent as it was concealed. Today, she resolved, she would bring the matter to a head, orchestrating a confrontation to unravel the truth. The village hall, where the Fate Committee had planned a meeting to discuss the scandal's aftermath, provided the perfect stage. Miss Marple, her tweed coat brushed and her demeanour as unassuming as ever, arrived early, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The hall was a bustle of activity, with villagers gathered in knots, their voices a low hum of speculation. Clara Henshaw stood near the tea urn, her face pale but resolute, while Victor Grange leaned against a wall, his dark eyes scanning the room with a guarded intensity. Mrs. Bantry, ever the organizer, bustled about, her cheeks flushed with the effort of maintaining order. "Jane," she called, spotting Miss Marple, "you're just in time. Everyone's in a state, Clara's insisting she's been framed, and Victor's threatening to leave the village altogether." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes taking in the scene. The tension between Clara and Victor was palpable, a taut thread ready to snap. She settled into a chair near the front, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. Inspector Craddock, summoned from Much Benham, stood at the podium, his notebook open, his expression one of weary determination. "We've got a serious matter here," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "The lab confirms an alkaloid in the saffron jar, a poison that caused the judge's illness. The torn recipe page and the scrap found in Mr. Grange's apron suggest foul play. I've asked you all here to clarify a few points." The room stilled, all eyes on Craddock. Miss Marple, however, watched Clara and Victor, noting the subtle shifts in their postures, Clara's hands twisting her apron, Victor's jaw tightening. Craddock continued. The recipe page, in Miss Henshaw's handwriting, was torn and singed, found in the bin near her station. The missing half, hidden in Mr. Grange's apron, suggests someone meant to mislead us. I'd like to hear from both of you. Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "I didn't tear my recipe. Someone stole it from my notebook to make me look careless. Victor's been after my secrets since Much Benham. He's the one who'd benefit from my ruin." Victor's eyes flashed, but his voice was cool. "That's nonsense, Inspector. I've no need for Clara's recipes. My chutney speaks for itself. Someone planted that scrap in my apron to frame me. I'd wager it was Clara, desperate to shift blame after her tart failed to impress." The room erupted in whispers, villagers exchanging glances, their loyalties divided. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. She rose, her voice gentle but clear. "If I may, Inspector, I'd like to ask a question or two. It's often the small things that clarify the larger picture." Craddock, accustomed to her interventions, nodded. Go ahead, Miss Marple. She turned to Clara, her eyes mild but piercing. Miss Henshaw, your recipe page, the ink was fresh, Dr. Haydock said. Why would you rewrite a recipe you've used for years? Clara's cheeks flushed, her hands clenching. I didn't rewrite it. Someone must have copied it, forged it even. I keep my notebook locked. A way Victor could have got to it. Victor snorted, his arms crossed. Why would I bother? My spices are my art, not her tired tarts. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Victor. And you, Mr. Grange, your saffron jar. The spill seemed so convenient, just as the judges tasted your chutney, and the label smudged as if handled in haste. Did you check its contents before using it? Victor's composure faltered, a bead of sweat glinting at his temple. I told you, it was an accident. I buy my spices from a trusted supplier. If there was poison, someone tampered with it before the fate. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the flicker of his eyes. A fleeting glance toward the door. She stepped forward, her knitting bag in hand, and produced the hidden recipe scrap, holding it up for all to see. This, she said, was found sewn into Mr. Grange's apron, a curious place to hide a recipe. Its ink matches the torn page, fresh and deliberate. Someone wanted it found, but not too soon. The room fell silent, all eyes on the scrap. Clara's face paled, while Victor's jaw tightened further. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. The saffron jar, laced with an alkaloid, was no accident. The poison was chosen to blend with your chutney's bold flavors. Mr. Grange and the torn recipe, Miss Henshaw, was meant to cast suspicion on you. But the hidden scrap tells a different story, one of calculation. She turned to Victor, her eyes like twin needles. You swapped the labels, didn't you? You replaced the saffron with a poisoned substitute, knowing your chutney spice would mask it. Then you tore Clara's recipe, leaving half in the bin to point to her, and hid the other half in your apron, to be found later, ensuring her guilt seemed certain. Victor's face drained of color, his hands clenching into fists. That's absurd, he snapped. I'd never, my reputation's ruined as it is. But his voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes, a flicker of fear that betrayed him. Clara, emboldened, stepped forward. I knew it. He's been out to get me since Much Benham, when he stole my prize. He's a cheat and worse. But Miss Marple raised a hand, her gaze still on Victor. And yet, Miss Henshaw, you knew more than you let on. Your garden contains foxgloves, which can yield an alkaloid like the one used. Did you suspect Victor's plan and say nothing, hoping he'd fall? Clara's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes darting to the floor. The room buzzed, villagers leaning forward, their whispers a rising tide. Inspector Craddock, sensing the moment, stepped in. Mr. Grange, you'd better explain yourself. The evidence saffron recipe, apron points to you. Victor's composure crumbled, his shoulders sagging. All right, he said, his voice low. I swapped the labels. I got the alkaloid in India, years ago, for another purpose. I only meant to sicken the judges, to ruin Clara's chance at the ladle. She humiliated me at Much Benham, called me a fraud in front of everyone. I tore her recipe to make it look like her mistake, hid the scrap to seal it later. But I didn't mean to hurt anyone badly. The confession hung in the air, a bitter note in the hall's stuffy warmth. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. Intent, Mr. Grange, does not erase harm. 3 people nearly died, and a village's trust was poisoned. Craddock signalled to Constable Jenkins, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Victor Grange, you are under arrest for attempted poisoning and tampering with evidence." The villagers gasped, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Clara, tears in her eyes, sank into a chair, her relief tinged with guilt. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, watched as Victor was led away, his head bowed. She thought of the alkaloid, its rarity suggesting a mind trained beyond cooking, and of Clara's silence, which had nearly cost lives. The confrontation had revealed the truth, but it left a shadow over St. Mary Mead. As the meeting dissolved, Mrs. Bantry joined her face a mix of awe and exhaustion. "Jane, you're a wonder. How did you know it was Victor?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "People, Dolly, are like patterns. You watch the stitches, and the flaws reveal themselves." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, Clara's notebook and the recipe scrap before her. The case was solved, but its echoes lingered: pride, revenge, and the fragility of trust. Her knitting resumed its rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to her thoughts. In St. Mary Mead, she knew even the most carefully laid plans could unravel under the right gaze, and she was content to be that gaze. Chapter 9. The Confession. The 7th morning after the tumultuous St. Mary Mead fete broke with a sky of bruised clouds, the village stirring under a pall of unease that lingered like the scent of rain on the wind. The confrontation at the village hall the previous day had left the community reeling. Victor Grange's arrest a thunderclap that echoed through every cottage and shop. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a single scone, gazed out at the green, where the contest tent stood as a forlorn reminder of the scandal. Her mind, as keen as the silver pins in her sewing basket, turned over the threads of the case. The torn recipe page, the poisoned saffron, the hidden scrap in Victor's apron, and the alkaloid that had nearly claimed 3 lives. Victor's confession had unravelled much, but Miss Marple knew that confessions, like half-finished tapestries, often hid loose ends. The village hall, where the truth had been laid bare, was now quiet, its chairs stacked and its tea-urns cold. Miss Marple, her tweed coat donned and her hat pinned with care, set out to tie up those ends, her steps measured but purposeful. The confession had confirmed Victor as the culprit, but questions lingered: why had he chosen such a risky plan? And had Clara, with her silent knowledge of plants, played a role? Miss Marple's instinct, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that the full story was not yet told. Her first stop was the police station in Much Benham, where Inspector Craddock had taken Victor after his arrest. The station, a squat brick building with a perpetually creaking door, was a hub of activity, with constables bustling about and typewriters clacking. Craddock, looking weary but satisfied, greeted her in his office, a cluttered room smelling of ink and tobacco. "Miss Marple," he said, rising, "you've done it again. Victor's confessions, solid attempted poisoning, tampering with evidence. He's not denying it now. But I suppose you're here for more than a pat on the back." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "You're very kind, Inspector. I only wish to clarify a point or two. Mr. Grange's confession, was it complete? Did he mention how he obtained the alkaloid, or why he chose Clara's recipe as his decoy?" Craddock leaned back, his fingers tapping his desk. He was cagey about the alkaloids. Source said he got it years ago in India. Kept it for emergencies. As for the recipe, he admitted tearing it from Clara's notebook during the fate setup, when no one was watching. Said he wanted to make her look sloppy, to shift suspicion. The hidden scrap in his apron was meant to be found later to clinch her guilt. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the fresh ink on the recipe scrap, a detail that still nagged. And did he say why the ink was fresh? Clara's tart recipe is old, yet the writing was recent. Craddock frowned, flipping through his notes. He didn't explain that. Said he copied the recipe to make it look authentic. But the ink, well, the lab's still checking. Why do you think it's significant? Miss Marple's smile was serene. In a village, Inspector, even the smallest detail can tell a story. Might I speak with Mr. Grange? Sometimes a quiet chat reveals what formal questions Miss Craddock, accustomed to her methods, arranged for her to visit Victor in the station's holding cell. The cell was stark, its walls bare save for a small window letting in a sliver of grey light. Victor sat on a cot, his once confident demeanour replaced by a haggard slump. His dark eyes flicked up as Miss Marple entered, a flicker of defiance in them. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, come to gloat. "I've told them everything, there's nothing more to say." Miss Marple settled onto a chair, her knitting bag in her lap, her expression as gentle as a grandmother's. "Not to gloat, Mr. Grange, but to understand. You admitted to swapping the saffron for poison, to tearing Clara's recipe. But why such an elaborate plan? A simple spice could have won you the ladle without risk." Victor's jaw tightened, his hands clenching. "It wasn't about the ladle," he said, his voice bitter. "It was about her Clara. At Much Benham, she called me a cheat, said my spices were tricks, not talent. The whole village laughed. I wanted her to feel that shame, to lose everything." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm in the cell's silence. "And the alkaloid?" she asked. "You said you kept it from India. For what purpose?" Victor's eyes darted away, his fingers tapping the cot. "I worked with a chemist there years ago. He showed me compounds, medicines, poisons. I kept some, thinking they might be useful. I never meant to kill, only to sicken, to make Clara's triumph bitter." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the weight of his choices in his sagging shoulders. "And the recipe scrap," she pressed, "hidden in your apron. Why not destroy it entirely?" Victor's gaze met hers, a spark of defiance returning. "I needed insurance. If the poison was traced to me, I'd make sure Clara took the fall. I copied her recipe, tore it, left half in the bin to look like her mistake. The other half I hid, to be found if I needed to seal her guilt." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the fresh ink? You wrote it recently, didn't you?" Victor hesitated, then nodded. "I did it the night before the fete, from memory. I'd seen her notebook before. She's careless, leaves it lying about." The confession was detailed, but Miss Marple's mind snagged on the ink, the careful stitching of the apron pocket. Victor's story was plausible, yet something felt off, like a stitch dropped in a complex pattern. She thanked him and left, her thoughts turning to Clara. Had she truly been unaware, or had her silence about Victor's actions hinted at complicity? Miss Marple made her way to Clara's cottage, where the baker was in her kitchen, rolling out pastry with a ferocity that spoke of lingering anger. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice tight, "I heard Victor confessed. It's over, isn't it? I'm cleared." Miss Marple, peering at the foxgloves in Clara's garden, smiled gently. "Nearly, my dear. But I wondered, did you ever suspect Victor's plan? Your garden suggests a knowledge of plants, perhaps even their dangers." Clara's hands stilled, her eyes flashing. "I grow herbs, not poisons. I suspected Victor was up to something. He was always snooping, but I didn't know about the saffron. If I had, I'd have stopped him. Miss Marple noted the tremor in Clara's voice, the quick glance at her garden. "And your notebook," she said, "left lying about, as Victor claims." Clara's cheeks flushed. "Never. I keep it locked in my bureau. He must have broken in, the sneak." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the fresh ink, the hidden scrap. Clara's indignation was convincing, but her knowledge of plants raised questions. Had she seen the mislabeled jar and stayed silent, hoping Victor would fall, leaving Clara's cottage? Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, where her friend was sorting through fate records. "Jane, you're a wonder," Mrs. Bantry said, offering tea. "Victor's confession has everyone talking. But Clara's still jumpy, says. Her reputation's ruined, even if she's innocent." "Do you think she knew anything?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "People, Dolly, often know more than they say. Clara's garden, Victor's past, they both have knowledge that could be dangerous. The question is how they used it." At the village shop, Miss Weatherby was abuzz with news. "Victor's locked up, and good riddance," she said, handing Miss Marple a packet of needles. "But Clara's not herself. She was in here, buying flour, muttering about her notebook. Said it's her life's work, and someone tried to destroy it." Miss Marple, her expression bland, asked, "Did she mention Victor's spices?" Miss Weatherby nodded, said he was always flaunting them, acting superior. "I saw her at the fete, near his station, looking at his jars like they were poison themselves." The detail caught Miss Marple's ear. Clara's presence near Victor's station, her knowledge of plants, her locked notebook, it suggested she might have suspected more than she admitted. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, Clara's notebook open before her. The torn page, the hidden scrap, the fresh ink, they pointed to Victor's scheme. But Clara's silence was a shadow in the pattern. Had she known of the poison and let it play out, hoping to see her rival undone? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind clicking like a clock. The confession had clarified much, but the truth was layered, like dough folded over. Itself, Victor's motive, revenge for Much Benham, was clear, but Clara's role remained murky. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew even a confession could hide a deeper truth, and she was determined to stitch it together before the villagers' wounds festered further. Chapter 10. The Silver Ladle. The 8th morning after the scandalous St. Mary Mead fete dawned with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the lingering clouds to bathe the village in a hesitant glow. The arrest of Victor Grange and his confession had quelled the storm of suspicion, yet a quiet unease persisted, like the faint creak of a settling house. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a lightly buttered scone, gazed out at the village green, where the contest tent had been dismantled, leaving only trampled grass as a reminder of the drama. Her mind, as precise as the stitches in her knitting, sifted through the case's final threads: the torn recipe page, the poisoned saffron, the hidden scrap in Victor's apron, and Clara Henshaw's unspoken knowledge. The truth was out, but Miss Marple knew that resolutions, like half-mended garments, often required a final touch to hold fast. The village, determined to reclaim its cheer, had revived the fate's closing ceremony, scheduling it for that afternoon. The Silver Ladle, the contest's coveted prize, was to be awarded, and Clara, cleared of suspicion, was the default winner. Miss Marple, her tweed coat brushed and her hat pinned with care, resolved to attend, not for the pomp, but to observe the village's pulse. She sensed that Clara's triumph, though deserved, carried a weight of guilt, and that the community's healing required more than a polished trophy. Her steps, as she left her cottage, were slow but purposeful, her knitting bag a familiar companion. The high street was alive with preparations, villagers stringing bunting and setting up stalls with a determined gaiety, Mrs. Bantry overseeing the ceremony's logistics, spotted Miss Marple and waved her over. "Jane, you're a blessing," she exclaimed, her hat slightly askew. "We're putting on a brave face, but it's not the same, is it? Clara's to get the ladle, but she's been so quiet hardly the victor's glow, and the judges, poor things, are still recovering. Mr. Pye's threatening to write to the Times about it." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes scanning the crowd. "A village heals slowly, Dolly, but a ceremony can mend much if hearts are open." At the green, a small platform had been erected, draped in red cloth and flanked by vases of late summer roses. The silver ladle gleamed on a velvet cushion, its sheen a beacon of tradition. Clara stood nearby, her face pale beneath the new hat, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple, settling into a chair near the front, noted the faint tremor in Clara's posture, as if the weight of the past week still pressed upon her. The crowd gathered, their murmurs a mix of relief and curiosity. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, leaned close to Miss Marple, whispering, "Clara's been in her garden all week, tending those foxgloves like they're her children. Do you think she knew about Victor's poison?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene. "People, Mrs. Clement, often see more than they say, but guilt comes in many shades." Her thoughts turned to Clara's herb garden, its foxgloves, a silent hint of knowledge, and to Victor's confession, which had laid bare his revenge but left Clara's role in shadow. Had she suspected the mislabeled saffron and stayed silent, hoping her rival would fall? The question lingered, a loose thread in the case's fabric. The ceremony began with a speech from Dr. Haydock, who, as a judge, represented the contest's integrity. "We've had a trying time," he said, his voice steady, but St. Mary Mead endures. "Our winner, Miss Clara Henshaw, has shown skill and resilience. Let's celebrate her triumph." The crowd applauded, though the sound was muted, as if tempered by memory. Clara stepped forward, her smile strained, and accepted the ladle from Dr. Haydock. Its silver caught the sun, a fleeting flash that drew gasps. But Clara's eyes were downcast, her fingers gripping the handle tightly. Miss Marple watched her, gaze sharp but kind. Clara's victory was hollow, tainted by the scandal and her own unspoken doubts. As Clara returned to her seat, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and approached her. "Congratulations, my dear," she said softly. "It's a fine prize, well earned." Clara's eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude mingled with unease. "Thank you, Miss Marple, but it doesn't feel right, after all that's happened. I keep thinking, if I'd spoken up, seen something." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's hand rested lightly on her arm. "You saw Victor's jars, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. "At the fete, near his station." Clara's breath caught, her eyes widening. Yes, I noticed the saffron. It smelled wrong, sharp, not like mine. But I thought he was just using some foreign blend. I didn't know it was poison, I swear." Her voice rose, drawing glances, and Miss Marple guided her to a quieter corner of the green, her demeanour calming. "I believe you, Clara," Miss Marple said. But you didn't tell anyone, did you? You let the judging go on. Clara's hands twisted the ladle, her knuckles white. I was angry, she whispered. Victor humiliated me at Much Benham, called my baking dull. When I saw his jar, I thought, let him fail, let his fancy spices ruin him. I never dreamed it was dangerous. Tears welled in her eyes, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was clear. Clara's silence had been a choice, born of resentment. But it was not a crime. You've carried a heavy burden, Miss Marple said, but the truth is out now. Let the ladle be a reminder not just of victory, but of forgiveness for others and yourself. Clara nodded, her shoulders easing slightly, and Miss Marple left her to the crowd's well wishes, her thoughts turning to the villagers' healing. She made her way to the village hall, where Inspector Craddock was reviewing his final report. Miss Marple, he said, looking up, you've tied this up neatly. Victor's in custody, and the case is closed. Anything else on your mind? Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Only a small matter, Inspector. Clara's silent she suspected something amiss with Victor's saffron, but didn't speak. It's not a crime, but it's a lesson. Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. She's lucky it wasn't worse. Victor's alkaloid came from a chemist in Bombay. He says kept it for years, waiting for a chance like this. The recipe scrap was his final touch, meant to bury Clara. You saw through it, though. Miss Marple's smile was faint. I only saw what was there, Inspector. People's hearts, not their plans, tell the story. Leaving the hall, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, where her friend was pruning her roses with renewed vigour. Jane, you're a miracle, Mrs. Bantry said, offering a glass of lemonade. The village is settling, thanks to you. Clara's got her ladle, but she's not herself. Do you think she'll recover? Miss Marple sipped her drink, her eyes on the garden's blooms. Time, Dolly, and honesty mend most wounds. Clara's learned a hard truth about herself. It's a start. At the village shop, Miss Weatherby was abuzz with the ceremony's details. Clara looked pale, holding that ladle, she said, handing Miss Marple a tin of tea. But it's good to have it done. Victor's gone, and we can move on. Though I heard Clara was in her garden again, tending those foxgloves. Queer, after all this. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the foxgloves, their silent hint of danger. Clara's knowledge, unused but present, had been a shadow in the case, a reminder of how close resentment could come to ruin. Returning to the green, Miss Marple lingered near the platform, now being dismantled. The crowd had thinned, villagers drifting to stalls or home, their chatter lighter but cautious. She thought of Victor's confession, his revenge born of a wounded pride, and Clara's silence, a mirror of the same flaw. The silver ladle, gleaming in Clara's hands, was a symbol of triumph, but also of the cost of envy. Miss Marple's gaze swept the village, its cottages and lanes a tapestry of human nature. Flawed but enduring. Back at her cottage, she settled. Into her armchair, Clara's notebook and the recipe scrap before her. The case was closed, the poison traced, the motive laid bare. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the villager's heart, its trust bruised but resilient. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to her reflections. Ambition, she murmured, echoing her words to Mrs. Bantry, can spice a dish too far. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, even the brightest prize could cast a shadow, but it was in those shadows that truth and healing were found.